Hey, what's up, y'all? And of course, welcome to another alternative factuals video. Okay, so this video is going to be something that's never really been done before in terms of, the topic and kind of a prediction kind of vibe I got going on here, but I'll dive into the details of this video. But for the most part, I'm going to be just talking about the Crisis on Infinite Earths event and the downfall, or the destruction, or perhaps collapse of the Speedforce. But before I dive into any of those details or anything related to the video, please be sure to like, share, and of course subscribe. Leave your comments down below. Let me know what you're thinking. Let me know what you're feeling. And without further ado, let's kind of just dive into this. Okay, so I'm going to definitely go into depth about what I mean the collapse of the Speedforce. Now, the Crisis on Infinite Earths event is an event that is definitely, at least in the comic books, it was a 12-issue series, basically an event in which they composed or condensed everything into a singular universe. So things from like Earth 1 or Earth 2 or Earth 3, whichever Earth you were from in the DC universe, ultimately the limited series that started in April of 1985 basically condensed everything into a singular universe, so that way going forward for the next few years, everything happened on the same Earth. All the characters were pretty much, I guess, in the same universe. Wally West or Barry Allen, whatever. Well, Barry Allen was, dead technically at the time, but Wally West was able to communicate with Jay Garrick, for example, and he didn't have to cross Earth to do it. Same thing for, any characters like Superman and then Power Girl, whatever the case may be. Ultimately, these characters were in the same universe. Now, this is what I'm going to try and make sense of this, because I saw this online, but I kind of wanted to talk about it because I kind of thought the same thing. Now, I figured the event initially, when it comes to the CW, could potentially be them kind of introducing the concept or the destruction of the Speedforce entity. Now, basically, this is something that's actually being explored currently in the Year of the Villain in DC Comics, well, in DC Rebirth, in the Flash number 76, which I don't remember if it came out already or if it's about to come out, one of the two. Well, either way, this is something that's not brand new to the DC universe. It's something that's being done presently in the newer comics. And one thing we do know about the CW shows in general is that if fans usually have a taste or a good idea or just the overall enjoyment of a particular story arc or certain villain or superhero, if anything, they will try and bring them into the story in their own way. So I'll give you an example. Godspeed. Everyone wanted to see Godspeed in the Flash TV show. Now, ultimately, he was not a main villain. However, we still got to see what Godspeed would look like. He's kind of a false speedster. I believe he's using the formula to accelerate his body. I forgot what it was. The X. I don't know. I'm not even going to try and guess it. Obviously, it'll pop up on the screen when I'm editing this, so you'll see that. But ultimately, you'll still get pieces of the story that you may enjoy. It may not be the way that you want it, but they will do something if they feel like it's popular enough or might draw enough people. Now, this is what I want to do when it comes to the Speedforce and the potential collapse in a future season, maybe in season 7, 8. I don't know how many seasons probably going to go on, probably till 8 seasons, so maybe season like 7 or 8. But ultimately, the Speedforce, for those of you who are not fully aware of what the Speedforce is, the Speedforce is technically an energy field that grants all speedsters their power, including people like Barry Allen, if we're talking about the TV show, Barry Allen, Wally West, Jesse Quick, and even, Excess, who was Barry Allen's daughter from the future. And for a short moment in time, you also know that Reverse Flash was tapping into the Speedforce. Now, the Speedforce was basically, a very vague concept, at least when it was initially introduced. The abilities of the Speedforce were basically just allowing people to tap into it, or basically allowing those who were able to access it super speed, the ability to time travel, the ability to kind of, shift from different Earths based on their vibrations. And one thing that is still very much consistent throughout the history of the Speedforce is that Barry Allen from the original Earth Prime created this, meaning once he created the Speedforce, it permeated throughout all of time and space, meaning he caused a change in the timeline by bringing this thing into existence in the first place. Now, the reason why I say it's very much possible for the Crisis on Infinite Earths event to possibly be the collapse of the Speedforce is because in the original event, Barry Allen was dead, and the concept of the Speedforce actually is very representative of the universe. The Speedforce represents the forward momentum of time. The main time stream, the progression of life and evolution and everything in the universe. It represents movement, moving forward. Everything that you ever think of when it comes to progress, that is what the Speed Force represents. And obviously the opposite would be like the reverse, with a negative Speed Force. Basically, things can move just as quickly backwards as they can forward, for example. So things like that. Now, if you really take the time to think about what does this Crisis on Infinite Earths event really represent, it's basically the destruction of the multiverse. And in order to destroy something, ultimately you have to stop it from developing or progressing in a forward linear kind of motion, which ultimately would describe why the Crisis on Infinite Earths would be an event, or at least in the comic books, I feel like should have been an event that brought the Speed Force, at least to an end, or somehow had some sort of intervention with the Speed Force due to the nature of what the Speed Force represents and what its connection is to the universe. Now, I know what some of you are going to say. Yes, I'm well aware. The Speed Force technically did not exist during Crisis on Infinite Earths. The Speed Force made its first appearance in the Flash 95 of November 1994. And basically it was a part of a 6-issue story arc titled Terminal Velocity, and then basically it finished with the Flash 100 in 1995, and then at this point they explained the concept of the Speed Force and ultimately introduced what the Speed Force was, its relation to the universe, as well as how powerful and its abilities that it kind of covered, and so on and so forth. So ultimately, I know this could have been a concept that they introduced in 1985 when it came to the Crisis on Infinite Earths event, but like I said, the Speed Force was not a concept. It was invented about like 10 years later, but ultimately that's the reason why when people thought like Barry Allen died, initially he was supposed to be dead, but then when they introduced the Speed Force, that's kind of where things got a little murky. But just to make things a little cleaner, so that way when I decide to finally wrap this up, it'll be very simple. But ultimately, this is what I'm trying to say. Bringing the end of the universe, or the Crisis on Infinite Earths event, try saying that fast, is basically an event in which it's the destruction of the multiverse. It's bringing everything into a singular universe, so that way everything can exist in one singular timeline, one singular universe. No alternate timelines, no alternate universes, none of that. It's basically just a singular timeline in which everything takes place. And in order for that to happen, like I said, things must come to a halt. Destruction of the universe comes to a stop. Think of it like this. Imagine if the Earth stopped rotating. You don't understand how much mayhem would happen, how much destruction and chaos would happen once the Earth stopped moving. Most planets and most asteroids, everything in the universe is still moving. The universe itself is moving. The cosmos itself is moving. Everything in the universe represents motion, and that's the reason why everything kind of operates in harmony. Now imagine an event like this in which it's trying to collapse everything into a singular moment. In order to do this, you have to bring everything to a stop, which is why in the DC Rebirth stories of Year of the Villain and this whole Justice League thing with Perpetua and these new forces, the reason why the Still Force is such a problem is because that's what it represents in a lot of ways. Now, besides the Still Force and that new concept, if they were to introduce something similar to that in 1985, initially when the first event of Crisis on Infinite Earths was written in the comic books, ultimately I do think the event should have been, or at least potentially could have been, the reason why the Speed Force either might have been broken, or it could have been destroyed, or it could have collapsed on itself, or gotten weaker. Any of those reasons would be valid. But ultimately this could prove to be like an Easter egg to the destruction of the Speed Force, or maybe the introduction of the Still Force. But ultimately the Speed Force is currently in jeopardy. At least I feel that way based on the events, what we know about the series so far. And the CW would do something like that because the Still Force, and for the most part a lot of the Flash mythos in recent comics, have been relatively popular, so I'm pretty sure the show would want to capitalize on that. But let me know what you think. Do you think the Crisis on Infinite Earths event should be an event in which they hint at the possible destruction of the Speed Force, especially with the whole Barry Allen supposedly supposed to be disappearing? Do you think they should introduce this the Still Force? Let me know what you think. This is something interesting. Like I said, I saw this online and I wanted to kind of talk about it because the collapse of the Speed Force could very much be the catalyst to starting this whole event if they were to take that route. And if you're new to the channel, please be sure to like, share, and of course subscribe. Leave your comments down below. Let me know what you're thinking. Remember, all of this is theory based. None of this is confirmed. Unless I tell you it's confirmed, it's it's pretty much just speculation at this point, or there's just Easter eggs and hints. And I hope to see you later on. Peace out.